the sting of my stepmother's hand, all because I refused to call her mom, used to be the worst thing I carried. But that single act of violence was what pushed my grandfather to rewrite history. By the time the will reading arrived, their futures were already ashes. They lost the house, the company, everything. And I never had to lift a finger. My name is Madison Pierce. I am 32 years old, and I was sitting in a room that hated me. The house was in Maple Ridge, Colorado, a sprawling glass and steel box perched on a cliffside, overlooking a valley that always seemed to be covered in mist. Savannah, my stepmother, had commissioned it 5 years ago. She called the style austere warmth. It was a monument to her taste, which meant it was a fortress of muted beige tones, brushed steel, and sharp, modern edges designed to photograph well and live terribly. We were in the formal dining room, a cavernous space I had been in perhaps 5 times before, even during the years I technically lived here. The mahogany table was a single, polished slab, so vast it felt more like a boardroom than a place for a family. It was polished to such a high gloss I could see the distorted, wavering reflection of the crystal chandelier, a monstrosity that looked less like a light fixture and more like a frozen waterfall, or perhaps an instrument of torture. The silverware was heavy, ornate, and like every other surface in the house, freezing cold to the touch. It was laid out with a terrifying, geometric precision on linen placemats that probably cost more than my first car. There were flowers, of course. A long, low arrangement of white lilies ran down the center of the table. Their scent was thick and cloying, an overpowering sweetness that always reminded me of a high-class funeral. Savannah was holding court at the head of the table, the seat that should have been my mother's, and later, the seat that my grandfather, Walter, usually claimed by sheer force of will. But tonight, Savannah was the queen. She was radiant. Her ash-blonde hair pulled back in a chignon so tight it seemed to stretch the skin over her high cheekbones. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse, and every time she moved, the light caught the constellation of diamonds on her wrist. She was performing the role of the perfect, gracious hostess, laughing a tinkling, practiced laugh at something my father said. Her entire existence was a performance. But her eyes, when they swept the table, were not warm. They were sharp, pale blue. The eyes of a CEO scanning a balance sheet for discrepancies, for any column that didn't add up in her favor. And when they swept past me, they didn't even pause. It was an art form she had perfected, making me invisible. I was not a person, just a smudge on the glass, a minor imperfection in her otherwise flawless composition. My father, Eric Pierce, sat to her right. He was checking his watch, for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "The market had a good rally today," he offered, speaking to the chandelier. "Tech stocks are finally bouncing back. Surprised everyone." I watched him tap his fork against the rim of his plate. Tap, 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 a nervous, hollow sound. He hadn't made direct eye contact with me since I'd arrived 2 hours ago, offering only a brief, awkward hug that felt like gripping a handful of coat hangers. My father was a man who lived his life on the surface. He avoided the dark, churning depths where real conversations and conflicts lived. He preferred the shallow end, where the water was warm and Savannah controlled the thermostat. Across from me, my half-siblings, Lily and Owen, were masters of the covert phone scroll. Lily was 16, a perfect, pouting miniature of Savannah, already fluent in the language of disdain. Owen was 14, pale and quiet, his shoulders permanently hunched. They didn't just ignore me, they looked at me, when they looked at all, with a polite, cultivated vacancy. It was as if I were a distant, unfortunate cousin they'd been forced to meet at a holiday, not the sister who used to live in the room at the end of the hall. To them, I was an artifact. I was the inconvenient, unpolished relic from my father's first, less advantageous marriage. This was the first time I'd been back for a family dinner in, God, how long? It had to be at least 4 years. Not since the incident. Not since the slap that had echoed in this very house, the sound sharp and ugly in the marble foyer, the sound of a line being permanently, irrevocably drawn. I had sworn to myself that day, driving away with my cheeks still burning, that I would never come back unless I absolutely had to. And now, I had to. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with the heavy silver knives. It was a living thing, coiling around one specific, magnetic point, the empty chair at the other head of the table. Grandpa Walter's chair. "I just wish Walter would get here," Savannah said, dabbing the corners of her perfect, coral-painted mouth with a linen napkin. Her voice was laced with a faux, sugary concern that set my teeth on edge. "These late-night meetings with his lawyers, it's just so worrying for a man his age. All this stress." Worrying, that was the right word, but not for the reasons she was implying. They were all worried. Worried he might live another 20 years. Worried he might finally see them for what they were. Lily looked up from her phone, her first sign of genuine engagement all night. "Is Grandpa really changing the will again?" "Daddy, I thought you said it was settled. You said he promised." My father flinched, a small, bird-like motion. "Lily, that is not polite dinner conversation." "Oh, stop it. Eric," Savannah said, waving her hand dismissively, her diamonds flashing. "We're all adults here." Her eyes flickered to me, a tiny, dismissive amendment. "Mostly, it's perfectly natural to want to ensure your family's future is secure. Walter just needs to simplify his estate. All these complicated trusts and side projects, it's confusing. It's what's best for everyone." What she meant was, it's what's best for me. They were vultures, all of them, sitting around this cold, polished table, waiting for a man to die so they could pick over the bones of his life's work. Pierce Horizon Freight. They were all so certain, so blindingly arrogant in their assumption that they were the primary beneficiaries. Eric, as the only son, Savannah, as the controlling, influential wife, Lily and Owen, as the designated, real grandchildren. They believed they were untouchable. They believed the future was already written, notarized, and filed away in their favor. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint tink of Owen's fork against his teeth. "So, Madison," Savannah said suddenly. Her voice was bright and sharp, like a dental tool probing a sensitive nerve. She had found her new target. "Still working at that little compliance firm in Denver?" "It's a risk analysis group. Savannah," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly even. I would not let it shake. "Northline Compliance." Right. Playing with spreadsheets. It sounds quaint." She smiled, a tight, bloodless expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I was just telling your father. We really must find you a place back here. Maybe in the marketing department at the company. You could learn so much from me. It's a real, tangible career." "I'm happy where I am," I said. "Nonsense," she laughed, that tinkling, empty sound again. "You're 32. It's time to stop playing student and build a real future. And your posture, dear, you're slouching again." I instinctively sat up straighter, my muscles tensing, and I hated myself for it. "A strong presence is half the battle in business," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "You have to project success if you ever want to achieve it." I felt the heat rise in my neck, a familiar, humiliating burn. It was always like this, not one single, massive blow, but 1,000 tiny cuts, a constant, relentless stream of corrections and criticisms designed to remind me that I was lesser, wrong, unfinished, an unpolished project she had long since given up on. My father just cleared his throat and took a sudden, intense interest in his asparagus, studying it as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was an expert in the art of strategic cowardice. I let her words hang in the air. I let her feel the small, pathetic victory of putting me in my place. She mistook my silence for submission. They all did. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that the complex, multi-million-dollar will they were all banking on, the one that just needed simplifying, was already a ghost. It had been invalidated, shredded, and for all intents and purposes, burned. The will they were expecting had died this afternoon. It ceased to exist at precisely 3:45 p.m. in a quiet, wood-paneled law office downtown. They were waiting for a man who had already made his decision. They were fighting over scraps that had already been swept from the table. This entire dinner, this elaborate performance of a happy, reunited family, it was a grotesque farce, and I was the only one in the audience who knew the play was already over, and the lights were about to come on. My phone vibrated in my lap. It was a single, silent buzz under the heavy linen napkin, shielded from Savannah's prying, all-seeing eyes. I angled the screen toward me. One new message, from Walter. I had sent him my final report 2 days ago. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was just data. A detailed, forensic breakdown of Savannah's shell company. Redstone Harbor strategies, a ledger of the quiet, consistent transfers, the inflated consulting fees she was paying herself, siphoning value from Pierce Horizon Freight under my father's blissfully ignorant nose. It was all public information, if you knew exactly where to look, and I, thanks to my quaint little job, knew exactly where to look. I had sent it without comment, just the facts. The message on my screen was 6 words. I looked again. You were right. A cold, clean wave of vindication washed over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was just gravity, a heavy, undeniable, physical force pulling everything toward its inevitable, destructive conclusion. I looked up. Savannah was now complaining about the caterer's choice of wine pairing. My father was nodding along, his expression one of pained concentration. Lily and Owen were back on their phones, their faces illuminated by the ghostly blue light, completely, utterly oblivious. I turned my gaze, slowly, to the empty chair at the head of the table, Walter's chair. He wasn't just meeting with lawyers. He was setting a fire. He was planting a bomb. They thought they were just waiting for dessert. They had no idea. They didn't know the storm was already here. "That's nice, dear," Savannah murmured, dragging a silver-plated knife through a perfectly poached pear, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece. "More wine, Eric?" I let the image of her, so perfectly composed, blur in my vision, her voice, the clinking of the glasses, the heavy scent of the lilies. It all faded, replaced by the smell of damp earth and the high, thin whine of cicadas. The house in Maple Ridge wasn't my first home. That home was in a small, suffocatingly flat town in the Midwest. It was an old white colonial with black shutters that were always slightly crooked. No matter how many times my father straightened them, the house smelled like old wood. My father's burnt coffee, and the quiet, pervasive dust of neglect. Before Savannah, there was Catherine, my mother. Her leaving wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't violent or dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no screaming matches, no shattered porcelain. Her departure was like the slow erosion of a shoreline. By the time you noticed the land was gone, you couldn't even remember what it looked like before. My mother was a woman of profound, unshakable indifference. She was physically present, a pale figure reading paperbacks in the living room, but her mind was always somewhere else, somewhere warmer, brighter, and apparently child-free. She wasn't cruel. She was just absent, a watercolor ghost haunting her own life. I was young when she left, maybe 7 or 8. I remember sitting on the front porch steps with her, the air thick and yellow before a summer storm. She told me she was moving to Arizona. She said she wasn't built for this, gesturing vaguely at the house, at me. I didn't cry. It's difficult to mourn the loss of something you never truly had. It felt less like an abandonment and more like a correction, a quiet administrative change. She simply dissolved from our lives. My father, Eric, reacted in the only way he knew how. He buried himself. He disappeared into the humming fluorescent lights and diesel-scented ledgers of Pierce Horizon Freight. Back then, it was just Pierce Trucking, a regional company my grandfather, Walter, had built from 2 rigs and a stubborn refusal to fail. My father lived in a world of logistics, fuel indexes, and driver manifests. The company was tangible. It was a problem he could solve. I was not. Our house became a quiet, masculine void. We orbited each other. My father and I, two silent satellites held in place by a shared roof. It was lonely, but it was predictable. It was a stable, quiet sadness. And then, my father went to a business conference in Atlanta. He came back a different man, vibrating with an energy I hadn't seen before. He'd met someone. He spoke of her in terms of commerce. Dynamic. Incredibly sharp. Knows the market inside and out. He met Savannah. She didn't just enter our lives. She executed a hostile takeover. She arrived only a few months later, not with a suitcase, but with a moving van. She stood in the doorway of our quiet, dusty colonial, her posture perfect, her sharp blue eyes scanning the foyer with the critical gaze of a health inspector. At first, her attention was intoxicating, after a childhood of benign neglect. Savannah's intense, high beams focus felt like sunshine. She arrived with binders and fabric swatches. "This house, Eric," she announced, running a manicured finger along a dusty picture frame, "has good bones, but it's utterly joyless. We're going to fix that." And she did. The comfortable, worn-out floral sofa was replaced by a rigid, white linen monstrosity that no one was allowed to sit on. The warm, scuffed wooden floors were covered with pale, unforgiving carpets. She turned that same renovating zeal on me. I was a gangly, quiet child, all knees and elbows. Savannah took me shopping. She threw out my worn sneakers and comfortable jeans, replacing them with stiff, patent leather shoes that pinched my toes and itchy wool dresses I was terrified to stain. "You are a Pierce, Madison," she'd say, her voice a firm, smooth monotone as she yanked a brush through my tangled hair. "You must present as a Pierce. People form opinions in the first 3 seconds. We cannot afford to be sloppy." I was so desperate for maternal guidance, I mistook her control for care. I thought this was what mothers did. They corrected, they upgraded, they polished. The line wasn't just crossed, it was annihilated. It started with small invasions. She didn't knock. She would just materialize in my doorway, her eyes scanning my room. "What are you doing? Homework? Let me see it." She would reorganize my drawers, throwing away little trinkets I'd saved, calling them clutter, but the true violation, the one that broke the spell, was the diary. It was a cheap, flimsy book with a cartoon cat on the cover, the kind with a tiny, ridiculous lock that a paperclip could open. I kept it under my mattress. I was 10. I wrote about the things a 10-year-old writes about. The boy in my class I thought was cute, my frustration with math, and a growing, confused resentment for the woman who corrected the way I held my fork 3 times at every meal. I came home from school one afternoon. The house was quiet. I went to my room, and she was there, sitting on my bed, the pink book open in her lap. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It was a physical, profound sense of being invaded. She looked up, and I saw her. Really saw her, for the first time. There was no shame in her expression, no guilt, only cold, managerial annoyance. "Madison, we need to discuss this," she said, tapping the open page. "You're reading my diary." My voice was a whisper. "I was tidying your room, a task you're apparently incapable of," she said smoothly. "And this was left out. I'm frankly disturbed. The disrespect, the ingratitude, after everything I have done for you and your father. This is how you feel?" She wasn't apologizing. She was reprimanding me for having thoughts that didn't match the pristine, happy family narrative she was constructing. "Give it to me," I said, my hands shaking as I reached for it. She held it just out of my reach. "This kind of secrecy is toxic. In this family, we are open. We don't hide our feelings and write poisonous things. You will not be keeping this." She tore the pages out, right in front of me, and dropped them in the wastebasket. I tried to tell my father that night. I cornered him in his study. When I explained, my voice trembling, he just sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Maddie," he said, his voice weary. "Savannah is she's very organized. She's trying to be a mother to you. Can't you just try to meet her halfway? She's under a lot of stress." That was it. The moment I realized he would not protect me. He would always choose the path of least resistance. And Savannah was a mountain. I was a pebble. It was easier for him to kick the pebble out of the way than to move the mountain. My voice was gone. My words, my thoughts, my space. None of it mattered. I was being methodically, efficiently disappeared from my own home. Then Lily was born. 2 years later, Owen followed. If I was a ghost before, their arrival was the exorcism. The house, which had been Savannah's showroom, now became a shrine to the new family, the real family. Photographs of me were quietly moved from the mantelpiece to the hallway, and then to a box in the attic. I became an unpaid, unacknowledged au pair, the inconvenient artifact from my father's previous, less successful merger. My high school graduation photo was never framed. My only refuge was 2 states away. My grandfather, Walter Pierce, lived in Silver Glen, Wyoming. He was the patriarch. The man who had built the company my father was now slowly letting Savannah absorb. Walter was raw, unfiltered, and brilliant. He lived in a sprawling log and stone house that smelled of pine, old leather, and good whiskey. He was everything my father was not. He was present, he was sharp, and he listened. I spent summers with him. While Savannah was enrolling Lily in preparatory etiquette classes, Walter was teaching me how to read a commodities report. He didn't believe in kids' tables or dumbing things down. "Read this," he'd command, shoving the Wall Street Journal across the heavy oak breakfast table, pointing a calloused finger at an article. "This logistics merger in the Southeast. Tell me why it's a stupid move. I'll give you till lunch." He taught me to see the world not as it appeared, but as a series of systems, of inputs and outputs, of risks and leverages. He'd let me sit in his study while he took calls, making notes on a legal pad. "Your father," he said one evening, swirling amber liquid in a heavy glass, "is a good operations man. He knows how to get a truck from A to B, but he's got no stomach for a fight. He'd rather be liked than be right. That's a weakness. Madison, a fatal one. It's how you lose everything." He saw how I watched, how I absorbed. I never complained about Savannah. I didn't have to. I just presented the facts, the way he'd taught me. I mentioned, offhand, the new consulting firm Savannah had opened. I mentioned how my father had signed over power of attorney for convenience while they were on vacation. I was 16, sitting on his dock, staring at the glassy, dark water of the lake. "She's going to steal it, isn't she?" I asked, not looking at him. "The company." Walter was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the wind in the massive pines. "Your father," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, "refuses to see the fox in the henhouse. He's so afraid of being alone. He'd rather be eaten alive." He turned and looked at me, his eyes sharp enough to cut. "But you see it. You see things your father refuses to look at." It wasn't a compliment. It was a designation. He was telling me I was the only other person on the wall. The day I left for college at 18, I packed my entire life into a 10-year-old sedan. The accumulated trauma wasn't one big, screaming wound. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, a quiet, systematic dismantling of a person. Savannah gave me a cold, dry kiss on the cheek. "Do try and meet someone useful, dear," she'd advised. My father pressed a few $100 bills into my hand, his eyes veiled with a familiar, weak guilt. "Call us," he said. I pulled out of the long gravel driveway. I didn't look back. I was 18 years old, and I was on my own. I wasn't just going to college. I was going to war. I was going to learn how to build armor. And I swore to myself, as the Colorado mountains rose in my windshield, that I would never, ever be that helpless, silenced girl again. Denver was not a gentle city. It was a sprawling, sharp-edged place of glass towers and relentless sun, a world away from the misty, judgmental hills of Maple Ridge. I arrived in a car held together by rust and optimism, with 2 suitcases and a student loan packet that felt heavier than both. I found a tiny 1-bedroom apartment off campus with paper-thin walls and a radiator that hissed like a cornered snake. It was the first place that was truly, completely mine. I loved it more than I had ever loved that sterile glass box on the cliff. I chose my major with the same deliberate, defensive precision. Not English, not art, not anything Savannah could critique as soft. I chose data science and risk analysis. I chose the cold, hard certainty of numbers. I chose a world where facts were immutable, where 0.1 could never be argued into 0.2, where a conclusion was based on evidence, not on who had the loudest voice in the room. I was going to learn the architecture of systems, and by doing so, I was going to learn how to tear them down. The first phone call with Savannah after I declared my major was predictable. I was in the campus library, the call echoing slightly in the concrete stairwell. Data? Her voice was thin with poorly disguised contempt. My goodness, Madison, numbers? How? Dry. I always hoped you'd find something with a little more artistry. Men don't take women who just crunch numbers seriously. Dear, they find it terribly unfeminine. It's about predictive modeling. Savannah, I said, my voice flat. Well, I predict you'll be very bored and very single, she'd trilled, and hung up. I went back to the stacks and pulled a textbook on algorithmic theory. Her words were just white noise. My father's calls were different. They were infrequent and laced with a familiar, weary guilt. Maddie, he'd say, Are you doing okay? You can always, He never finished the sentence. He never just said, You can come home. I made it clear I didn't need to. I built a life that had no room for their brand of help. I worked in a way that left no time for doubt. I had 3 jobs. From 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., I was a barista, the smell of burnt coffee and steamed milk clinging to my hair. From 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., I worked data entry at the university's research library, my fingers flying across a keyboard in a quiet, sun-drenched room. On weekends, I transcribed interviews for graduate students, earning $50 a tape. I lived on black coffee, cheap pasta, and the intoxicating, unfamiliar feeling of self-reliance. I paid my rent, I paid my utility bills, I bought my overpriced textbooks. Every dollar I earned, every bill I paid, was a brick I laid in the wall between my present and my past. The 4 years of college blurred into a relentless, exhausting, and deeply satisfying grind. When I graduated, summa cum laude, I called my father. That's great, Maddie, just great, he said, his voice distant. I could hear Savannah whispering to him in the background. Listen, he said, his tone shifting, becoming falsely bright. We were just talking. Now that you've got this numbers thing out of your system, it's time to think about a real future. Savannah's firm, Redstone Harbor, is doing incredible things with branding. She thinks you could really benefit. Apprentice under her, learn how the real world works. I stood on the balcony of my tiny apartment, looking at the Denver skyline. Apprentice under her, go back, be the project, be the failure she could finally fix. That's not going to happen, Dad, I said, my voice colder than I intended. Maddie, don't be difficult, he sighed. She's just trying to help. This is a real opportunity to be part of the family business, to learn from the best. Pierce Horizon is Grandpa's business, I said, and Redstone isn't part of it. There was a sharp intake of breath, then a click. He had hung up. I didn't let it bother me. I threw my cap in the air, walked across the stage, and accepted my diploma. 2 weeks later, I had an interview. My real education, however, came from Wyoming. I drove to Silver Glen to see Walter every chance I got. Spring break, long weekends, a week at Christmas. His house was my true north. He'd be waiting on the porch, a thick wool sweater on, a glass of whiskey in hand, regardless of the time of day. So, he'd grumble, skipping any greeting. They teaching you anything useful? Or is it all just academic nonsense? And we would talk, not about my feelings. Walter had no patience for feelings. We talked about systems. He'd grill me on my classes. Risk analysis? Good. So, analyze this. I've got a competitor in the Midwest undercutting our fuel contracts by 8%. How? I'd sit at his massive oak desk, pull out my laptop, and I'd show him. I'd pull public shipping manifests, map their routes, analyze regional fuel tax incentives, and build a model that showed him exactly where their efficiency was coming from. He'd watch, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Good, he'd grunt. You see the skeleton. Most people just see the paint. During one of these visits, during my junior year, I mentioned Savannah. I didn't complain. I didn't whine about her insults or my father's weakness. I just stated a fact. I ran a standard corporate registration search, I said, pretending to be focused on a line of code on my screen. Just for practice, Savannah registered a new LLC about 6 months ago. Redstone Harbor Strategies. Interesting name. Walter went very still. He slowly put his glass down on the coaster. Is that so? Yeah, I said, still typing. Filed as a domestic LLC, single agent, her, classified as a strategic consulting firm, just found it interesting. Walter said nothing for a full minute. He just stared out the window at the lake. Finally, he nodded. Once. Good pull, Maddie. That's good work. We never spoke of it again, but I knew he'd heard me. The next semester, I logged into my student loan portal to make my monthly payment. My stomach dropped. The balance was wrong. A huge chunk of it, almost $30,000, was just gone, paid in full. I called him immediately. Grandpa, did you don't know what you're talking about, he barked. University must have made a mistake. Computers, nonsense. Now, tell me about this new quantitative easing policy. The Fed's lost its mind. I understood. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't charity. It was an investment. He was funding his own intelligence operation. He was arming me. This, of course, did not go unnoticed. As I became more independent, as my visits to Walter became more frequent, Savannah's concern turned into something sharper. She began to see me not as a nuisance to be corrected, but as a threat to be managed. She started calling me directly, bypassing my father. Madison, your grandfather sounds confused lately, she'd say, her voice a slick veneer of worry. He's talking about audits and trusts. You're not putting ideas in his head, are you? He's an old man. He's easily agitated. I'm just visiting my grandfather, Savannah, I'd reply. Of course, dear. Just remember who your family is. We're the ones who will be here, day in and day out, when all this school-time fun is over. It was a warning, wrapped in the language of care. The summer after graduation, I landed the job. Northline Compliance Group. We were the people companies hired to find out who was stealing from them. We were corporate hunters. We specialized in forensic accounting, digital paper trail reconstruction, and my personal favorite, asset tracing. My cubicle was clean, quiet, and mine, my boss, a woman named Diaz, was a former federal prosecutor who lived on black coffee and unfiltered facts. She taught me that everything leaves a trail. Every wire transfer, every invoice, every shell corporation, every text message. She taught me to see the patterns in the noise. For 2 years, I tracked stolen money through nested LLCs in Delaware, followed fraudulent invoices to phantom vendors in the Cayman Islands, and unraveled complex money laundering schemes. I learned, very quickly, the language of financial predators. I learned how people like Savannah thought. And then, one night, it happened. It was almost 3 a.m. I was running late on a case, digging through public and corporation databases for a client, on a whim. Driven by an instinct I couldn't name, I typed Pierce Horizon Freight into a federal contract search. It all came up, public record, harmless. Then I cross-referenced the vendor lists with the Colorado Secretary of State database. And there it was. Redstone Harbor Strategies. My fingers went cold. I wasn't an employee. I wasn't hacking. I was just a citizen, reading public records available to anyone. I started pulling the invoices. They were all there, filed as part of county-level transport bids. Strategic Marketing Consulting, $50,000. Brand Repositioning and Synergy, $72,000. Q3 Executive Logistics Advisory, $110,000. The payments started small, right after she'd filed the LLC. They grew, steadily, quarter after quarter. My father, the CEO, was signing off on payments to his own wife for services that were, at best, laughably vague, and at worst, completely fictitious. She wasn't just siphoning, she was draining the company. She was building her own lifeboat while drilling holes in the hull of my grandfather's ship. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a sharp, cold, breathtaking clarity. It was the same feeling as finding the critical flaw in a line of code. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. I downloaded every file, every public invoice, every state registration document, every timestamp. I saved it all to a new, encrypted drive, one I'd bought with cash that afternoon. I sat back in my chair, the office around me dark and silent, the only light coming from the glowing data on my screen. This wasn't a plan. It wasn't revenge. It was just data. It was the first solid, verifiable, undeniable piece of truth I had ever held. It was the first brick in a foundation for a building I hadn't designed yet, but I knew, instinctively, would be a fortress. And I knew it would be tall enough to cast a shadow over all of them. The message from Walter, "You were right," burned a hole in my lap. It was a single, clean fact in a room built on lies. My gaze snapped back to the table, to the performance in progress. Savannah had just finished a long, tedious story about securing a new zoning variance for a property she was developing. My father was listening with a look of profound, studious admiration, the way he always did. "A real triumph. Savvy," he said, raising his glass of red wine. "They really didn't know who they were up against." "They just needed a little firm guidance," Savannah said, smiling. She picked up her own glass, the crystal ringing with a high, clear note as she tapped it with a perfectly manicured nail. The sound was designed to command attention. "And on that note," she said, her voice rising, projecting to the corners of the cavernous room. She stood, a fluid, practiced motion. She was the queen, addressing her court. "I want to propose a toast." My father, Lily, and Owen immediately raised their glasses. I did not. I simply watched her. "To family," she said, her blue eyes scanning the table, deliberately, pointedly skipping over me. "To finally having all of us under one roof again. It has been far too long." She looked at me, a brilliant, false smile plastered on her face. "Welcome home, Madison. We've missed you." "The house looks lovely. Savannah," I said, my voice polite, level. I picked up my water glass. "The lilies are a strong choice." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She knew exactly what I meant. Funeral. She recovered instantly. "Thank you, dear. I do so love to make a home feel complete." She sat down, but the performance was not over. The toast had merely been the overture. Now came the rewriting of history. "I was just telling Eric the other day," she said, turning her focus to Lily. "It feels like just yesterday I was teaching you girls how to ride your bikes. Do you remember that, Madison? You were so afraid of letting go of the training wheels." I remembered my father teaching me. I remembered the scraped knees on the pavement of our old Midwest driveway. I remembered him cheering, long before she was ever in the picture. "I remember," I said. "Dad was very patient." Savannah's eyes tightened. "Yes, well, we all have our moments. But I was the one who insisted you get on that two-wheeler. A mother knows when her children are ready for the next step, even if they're afraid." There it was, mother. She wasn't just using the word. She was deploying it. It was a strategic placement, a claiming of territory, a retroactive insertion of herself into a past where she did not belong. "I was teaching Owen his multiplication tables just last week," she continued, "and it brought me right back to sitting at that old kitchen table with you, Madison, struggling through your algebra. You were so stubborn." A lie, a complete, audacious fabrication. I had struggled through algebra alone in my room. The only time Savannah had ever intervened in my homework was to criticize my handwriting or, on one memorable occasion, to read my diary. "You're misremembering. Savannah," I said quietly, taking a sip of water. "That didn't happen." The tink of silverware on china stopped. My father froze, a piece of asparagus halfway to his mouth. Lily, who had been scrolling under the table, looked up, her expression a perfect mirror of Savannah's indignation. "Excuse me?" Savannah said, her voice dropping all pretense of warmth. It was flat and cold. I said, "You're misremembering," I repeated, setting my glass down with a quiet, definite click. I looked her directly in the eye. "I did my algebra by myself. You were never involved." "Why are you doing that?" Lily snapped, her voice high and accusatory. "Why are you calling her Savannah like that? It's so disrespectful." "Lily, please," my father said, his voice weak, pleading. "Let's just have a nice dinner." "No, Eric," Savannah said, holding up a hand to silence him. He obeyed instantly. She turned her full, undivided, venomous attention to me. The mask was gone. This was the real woman, the one who tore up diaries, the one who billed her husband for imaginary consulting fees. "Your sister is right. Madison," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "It is disrespectful. After everything I have done for you, after I came into this broken house and built a home, after I raised you, fed you, clothed you, after all these years, is it so much to ask? Can you not, just once, show a single ounce of gratitude and call me Mom?" The silence in the room was absolute. It was a suffocating, pressurized void. I could hear my own pulse, a steady, calm thump-thump in my ears. I saw my father shrink, his gaze dropping to his plate, his shoulders hunching. He was making himself small. He was disappearing. I saw Lily, watching with undisguised, hungry anticipation. She wanted to see me broken. She wanted to see her mother win. Owen just looked terrified, his eyes wide, staring at his placemat. And I saw Savannah, leaning forward, her blue eyes narrowed, her entire body radiating a demand for submission. She believed she had me. She had cornered me in front of the family. She had isolated me. I thought of the text in my lap. "You were right." I thought of the encrypted drive in my apartment. I thought of my grandfather, somewhere in this city, setting a fire. I let the silence stretch. I let her wait for her victory. Then, I looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel heat. I just felt the cold, hard certainty of a fact. "No," I said. Savannah's face, the mask of the perfect hostess, didn't just crack, it shattered. "What did you say?" she whispered. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I said, "No, you didn't raise me. Savannah, you tolerated me. You are my father's wife. You are not my mother." It happened faster than I could have processed. 1 second, she was across the table. The next, she had lunged. She wasn't thinking. It was pure, reptilian instinct. Her hand shot across the polished wood, knocking over a water glass, the ice and water spilling across the lilies. Her fingers, strong and cold, clamped around my wrist. "You ungrateful little—" She yanked me, hard, pulling me forward, and with her other hand, she struck me. It wasn't a tap. It was a full, open-palmed, back-swinging slap. The sound was shocking, a sharp, ugly, wet crack that split the air of the pristine dining room. It echoed off the glass walls. My head snapped to the side. The force of it knocked me back into the chair. My cheek exploded in a white-hot, stinging pain. My eyes watered instantly. A purely physical reaction. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of her perfume, the same floral scent as the lilies, thick and suffocating. The room was frozen. Lily let out a small, terrified shriek. She had been, as always, holding her phone up, angled under the table. In the shock of the moment, she fumbled it, dropping it onto the table with a clatter. The screen was on. It was recording. Owen made a sound like a stepped-on animal. My father. My father did nothing. He stared, his face as pale as the linen napkins, his mouth open, paralyzed, a statue of a coward. Savannah was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her beautifully styled hair dislodged. Her hand was still raised, her fingers slightly curled. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a sort of shocked, primal fury. She had done it. She had lost control. The one thing she valued above all else. She had shown the room, shown all of us, exactly who she was. And then, from the entryway of the dining room, a new voice cut through the vibrating silence, a voice like gravel and iron. "That," said Walter Pierce, "is quite enough." My head turned, my cheek throbbing, pulsing with heat. He was standing there, framed by the dark wood of the doorway. He wasn't in his usual casual Wyoming attire. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit and a somber tie. He looked like a man who had just come from a funeral, or was about to start one. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was locked on Savannah. She hadn't seen him. His voice made her jump, and she spun around, her hand dropping, her face a mask of horrified, guilty shock. "Walter," she stammered, her voice suddenly thin, breathless. You're here. We were just—" "I saw what you were just doing, Savannah," Walter said. His voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly calm. He didn't move. He didn't rush to me. He didn't yell at her. He just stood, a pillar of judgment. He had seen it. He hadn't just heard the commotion. He had been standing there. He had seen the hand. He had seen the impact. My father finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled sound. "Dad, it was a misunderstanding. We were just—" Savannah was— Walter's eyes flicked to his son. It was the single most withering look I had ever seen. My father's words died in his throat. Walter looked back at Savannah, who was now desperately, uselessly, trying to straighten her silk blouse, her hands shaking. "Walter, please," she said, trying to regain her composure, trying to reassemble the mask. Madison she was being incredibly cruel. "I heard her," Walter said. "She was telling the truth." That single sentence hung in the air, more devastating than the slap had been. Walter Pierce looked around the room, his gaze passing over the spilled water, the terrified faces of Lily and Owen, the paralyzed form of my father, and finally, my face, my cheek already turning a dark, mottled red. He didn't come in. He didn't sit down. He simply pulled his phone from his pocket, looked at it, and then put it away. "I have some paperwork I need to review," he said, his voice as flat and final as a tombstone. "Immediately, it appears I have an addendum to make." He turned, his footsteps heavy and measured on the marble floor, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was a ringing, deafening void. Savannah stood, frozen, her hands still tingling. My father looked at the empty doorway, his face a landscape of pure, unadulterated dread. I finally allowed myself to take a breath. The bomb hadn't just been planted. The timer had just hit 0. The Bentley's engine was a quiet rumble beneath my feet, but it was the only thing that was calm. My hands were clamped to the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was not a man given to rage. Rage was sloppy, a waste of energy. What I felt was colder, heavier. It was the cold, clarifying weight of a final decision. I had seen her hand move. I had been standing in the marble entryway, having let myself in, listening. I had heard my granddaughter's voice, quiet, firm, and truthful. "You are not my mother." And I had seen Savannah lunge. I had seen the sound, a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the high ceilings. I had seen Madison's head snap back, and, worst of all, I had seen my son, Eric, my only son, stare at his plate, paralyzed, a portrait of pathetic, spineless cowardice. He had let it happen. He had watched that woman physically assault his own child, and he had done nothing. I put the car in gear. I did not speed. I drove with a terrible, measured calm toward the city. My mind was already working, replaying not just the last 5 minutes, but the last 10 years. This wasn't the first symptom. It was just the first gunshot. I remembered the small things, the way Savannah's voice, always so sweet, would cut Eric off in board meetings. "Oh, Eric, darling," she'd laugh. "What you mean to say is," and she would rewrite his words, his intentions, right in front of everyone, and he would just nod, grateful. I remembered Jim Akerley, my chief financial officer for 25 years, a man who could smell a bad investment from a mile away. Savannah had forced him into early retirement 2 years ago, replaced him with some young, slick 28-year-old with a fancy degree who didn't know a damn thing about freight logistics, but who clearly knew who his real boss was. I remembered the dinners, the constant, subtle corrections, the way she had slowly, methodically isolated Eric from his old friends, his old life, until his entire world was populated only by people she had approved, people who owed their loyalty to her. She wasn't a wife, she was a cuckoo bird. She had flown into my son's nest, pushed out everyone who truly belonged, and convinced him that her parasitic chicks were his. And I had let it happen. I had stood back, respecting my son's boundaries. Assuming he was a man, I had been wrong. It was 9:15 at night. I didn't go home. I drove to the downtown office of Judith Marrow. Judith was not a gentlewoman. She was a legal weapon. She was the sharpest, most ruthless estate lawyer in the state of Colorado, which is why I'd had her on a very expensive retainer for a decade. I used my private key to the building's garage. Her lights, as expected, were on. She was in her corner office, a sterile expanse of glass and dark wood, surrounded by precise stacks of files. She didn't look up when I walked in, just pointed a pen at the leather chair opposite her desk. "Walter," she said, her voice like dry ice. "I assume this is not a social call at this hour." I sat. The adrenaline from the scene was gone, replaced by a cold, operational resolve. She hit her, "Judith." Judith finally looked up, her eyes sharp, unblinking. She didn't need me to elaborate. She knew the players. "In front of him," I continued, my voice a low gravel, "heard my granddaughter deny her the title of mother, and that viper slapped her across the face, hard. My son just watched." Judith steepled her fingers. She didn't offer sympathy. She was a creature of action. "I see," she said. "So we are finally moving from the hypothetical to the tactical. What is the objective?" "The objective," I said, leaning forward, "is total annihilation. I want you to pull up my current will, the one from, God, 2014. I think—" "I don't need to," Judith said. "I drafted it. It's simple. Upon your passing, all controlling shares of Pierce Horizon Freight, plus the Wyoming house and all liquid assets, pass to your son, Eric Pierce. There are secondary provisions for his issue, but the primary heir is Eric, and," she added, her gaze unwavering, "as he is the primary, the assets are vulnerable to his spouse. The language is, to my son and his wife. It's exactly what you asked for." "What I asked for," I said, "was to protect my son's future. I did not anticipate I would need to protect it from my son. I assumed he had a spine. I was mistaken. He is a willing hostage." "So, the objective has changed," Judith stated. "The objective is to cut him out, to cut her out, completely. I want every share, every dollar, every square inch of land to go to Madison. How do we do it? And how do we make it stick?" Judith was quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against a legal pad. "It's a declaration of war. Walter, the moment you die, Savannah will contest it. She will drag Madison into court for the next 5 years. She'll claim undue influence. She'll claim senile dementia. She'll say Madison manipulated you. She will bleed the estate dry in legal fees trying to get her hands on it. Disinheriting an only son is messy. A judge will look at it with extreme skepticism. I don't care if it's messy, I growled. I care if it's effective. Then we don't use a will, Judith said. She swiveled in her chair and pulled a thick, black-bound file from a locked cabinet behind her. It was labeled with a simple, 3-digit code. We use the file we've been building. She opened it. Inside were spreadsheets, incorporation documents, and bank statements. Madison was right, Judith said, sliding a page across the desk. Her report was the starting point. My forensic team confirmed it. I looked at the page. It was a list of wire transfers. Pierce Horizon Freight to Redstone Harbor Strategies. Brand Synergy Consultation. Logistics Optimization Review. Executive Marketing Strategy. All nonsense. All for 6-figure sums. She's been bleeding you for 3 years. Walter, Judith said. Over $3 million that we can track. She's been transferring value, your company's liquid cash, into her own pocket, into a shell company where your son has no signature authority. She's building her own war chest with your money. And Eric? He signed every single invoice, Judith said flatly. Every one. He's either criminally negligent or complicit. In the eyes of the law, it doesn't much matter. This was the leverage. This was the why. I spoke with Jim Ackerley, Judith continued, referencing my old CFO. He signed a brutal NDA, but he's terrified enough of her to talk to me. He told me he brought these exact invoices to Eric. He warned him. Eric told him to stop being an obstructionist and trust Savannah's process. And Dave Schultz, I added, thinking of my best warehouse manager, a man who'd been with me since 1982. Fired last year for insubordination. He questioned a new, exclusive hauling contract, Judith confirmed. A contract with a carrier that was subcontracting, at a massive markup, to Redstone Harbor Strategies. She's paying herself twice. Eric signed that, too. He's been signing everything she puts in front of him, unread, for years. My son was not a victim. He was an accomplice, a fool, but an accomplice nonetheless. All right, I said, the plan forming, cold and clear. A will is too vulnerable, so we make the will irrelevant. We create a trust. Judith nodded, already picking up her pen. The Walter Pierce Revocable Living Trust. We transfer all assets into it, every share of Horizon, the Wyoming house, the art, the brokerage accounts, everything. The trust, I continued, will be the legal owner of all my assets. The will can only govern what's left outside of it, and if we leave nothing outside of it. The will is an empty document, she finished. A hollow shell. They can contest it all they want. They'll be fighting over a handful of dust. I will be the primary trustee, I said, effective immediately. And the successor trustee? Judith asked, her pen poised. The person who takes control upon your incapacitation or death? The person who will execute the trust's instructions? I looked at the photo of Madison on my desk, the one from her graduation, the only one in that damn house who wasn't a fool or a predator, the only one who saw. Madison Pierce, I said, sole successor trustee. It's a clean kill, Judith said, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. She won't see it coming until the will is read, and by then, it's too late. The trust supersedes the will. But she'll still fight, I said. She'll still claim I was senile tonight. Which is why, Judith said, you are going to do something very important. As soon as you leave this office, you are going to write a letter, a memorandum. You are going to detail, in your own hand, why you are making this change. You will date it, tonight. You will reference the report on Redstone Harbor. You will reference Eric's negligence. And you will reference, in precise, painful detail, the event you witnessed this evening. The slap, I whispered. You will state that you are of sound mind and body, Judith instructed. and that this action is a direct, rational response to the theft you've uncovered and the physical violence you witnessed against your granddaughter, which your son condoned with his silence. We will get it notarized in the morning. We will attach it to the trust documents. It will be our silver bullet against any claim of incompetence." I stood. The shaking was gone. I felt a profound, ice-cold clarity. "Draw it up, Judith," I ordered. "I'll go to my club. I'll write the memo. Have the trust documents couriered to me by 7 a.m. I'll sign them before the market opens." I walked out of her office. I drove to the quiet, dark-paneled library of my private club. I sat at a heavy mahogany desk. I took out a single sheet of my personal, watermarked stationery. And I wrote about my son's weakness. I wrote about Savannah's greed. I wrote about the sound of her hand hitting my granddaughter's face. I signed the trust documents at 6:45 the next morning. I took the new, original copy of the trust, the notarized memo, and the complete file on Redstone Harbor. I didn't put them in a bank vault. I drove them to Wyoming myself. I put them in the old, heavy-gauge steel safe hidden behind the landscape painting of the Tetons in my study. As I spun the dial, the heavy thunk of the bolts sliding into place was the most final sound I had ever heard. I placed my hand on the cold steel door. I thought of Madison, her cheek bruised, her spirit wounded. "They will pay for that," I whispered to the empty room. "They just don't know it yet." I left Maple Ridge that night with my cheek throbbing, a deep, ugly purple bruise already blooming under the skin. The physical pain was a dull, distant ache. It would be gone in a few days. The real wound was the one that had finally cauterized. The slap wasn't an attack. It was a confession. Savannah, in one violent, uncontrolled spasm of rage, had confirmed every suspicion I had ever held. She had finally shown me the predator beneath the silk blouse, and my father, with his silent, paralyzed, plate-staring cowardice, had co-signed her confession. He had made his choice. I didn't go back to my Denver apartment and cry. I didn't curl up and mourn the family I never had. I went online and searched for therapists specializing in narcissistic family systems. The next Monday, I was in the office of Dr. Eris. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, a hawk's unblinking gaze, and a zero-tolerance policy for self-pity. I laid out the facts of my life like a case file. The diary, the exclusion, the constant belittling, the financial manipulations I suspected, and finally, the slap. I expected sympathy, perhaps a box of tissues. Instead, I got a diagnosis. "This is not a dysfunctional family, Madison," Dr. Eris said, leaning forward, her voice calm and precise. "A dysfunctional family is a system that is broken. This is a highly functional corporate structure with a single, effective CEO. You were never a daughter. You were an unwanted asset from a prior merger. Your value to the new management was zero, so you were psychologically marked for liquidation. The slap wasn't a loss of control. It was a termination ritual. It was the most brutal and most validating thing I had ever heard. Our sessions were not about forgiveness. They were about deprogramming. Dr. Eris gave me vocabulary: gaslighting, projection, the scapegoat, the enabling spouse. She taught me that the constant, low-level anxiety I had lived with my whole life was not a personal failing. It was a symptom of being in a war zone. My job, she explained, was not to fix my family. It was to build a fortress. The first step was to build a wall. I learned the power of the word no, not as an argument, but as a full stop. I learned how to set a boundary and enforce it. My first test came a week later. My father called. His voice was thin, reedy, vibrating with a manufactured, second-hand remorse. "Maddie," he began, that was a terrible, terrible night. I've spoken with Savannah. She's just under an incredible amount of stress. She feels just awful about it." The old Madison would have seized on that. She feels awful? What about me? What about my face? I would have argued. I would have cried. I would have demanded he see my pain. The new Madison, the one with Dr. Eris's voice in her ear, took a slow, steadying breath. "Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of emotion. "I am not going to discuss Savannah with you. Her feelings are her own. I am fine. I have to go." "But Maddie, she just wants to—" "I have to go, Dad." And I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't justify. I simply ended the conversation. My hand was shaking, but my chest felt lighter. I had built the first brick of the wall. I took that new, cold, focused energy and poured it into the one place where facts mattered. Northline compliance became my sanctuary and my forge. The emotional static that had cluttered my brain for 2 decades, "Why don't they love me? Why am I not good enough?" was gone, replaced by the clean, quiet hum of data. My boss, Diaz, noticed the change. I wasn't just competent anymore. I was relentless. She started giving me the hard cases, the ones that required a different kind of mind, the ones that required me to think like a predator. I spent 3 months dismantling a fraudulent charity in Ohio. The director, a beloved local figure, was systematically bleeding the foundation dry. He had gained the board's total trust, isolated the elderly founder, and was siphoning donations into a series of shell companies, all registered as consulting firms. It was Savannah's playbook, just with a different logo. I spent the next 6 months on a case involving a tech startup. The COO was deliberately driving the company into debt, inflating expenses and signing bad contracts, all to devalue the stock. Why? So his silent partner, an outside shell corp, could buy the company for pennies on the dollar during the inevitable bankruptcy. I learned the psychology of the long con. I learned how predators leverage trust. I learned how they use love, loyalty, and family as weapons of extraction. This work changed me. The girl who had flinched at Savannah's dinner table corrections was gone. In her place was a woman who calmly explained to federal prosecutors how a multi-million-dollar empire was stolen with a handful of false invoices and a signature stamp. I became calm. I became realistic. I became decisive. My relationship with Walter changed, too. He started visiting me. He'd fly into Denver once a month, always citing banking business. We'd meet at the same place, a dark, old-school steakhouse with booths upholstered in red leather and waiters who knew not to interrupt. These were not family dinners. They were strategy sessions. He never told me what he had done that night at Judith Merrow's office. He never mentioned the living trust. He never said, "I've cut your father out and made you the successor." He was too smart for that. He was testing me. He was training me for a job I didn't even know I had been given. "Hypothetical," he said one night, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You have a holding company, solid assets, good cash flow, but you have a new liability at the executive level. A consultant who has the CEO's ear. This consultant is approving bad contracts, let's say, inflated contracts. How do you insulate the core assets from that person's influence without blowing up the whole company?" I didn't hesitate. "You can't. The rod is at the top. If the CEO is compromised, the company is compromised. You'd have to execute a hostile takeover and prove gross negligence to the board. Or failing that, set up a new, clean entity and prepare to buy the old company's assets at the bankruptcy auction." Walter just nodded, a grim flicker of approval in his eyes. "Go on," Armaya said. "You'd have to find a way to legally separate the assets from the CEO's control before the damage is done. A trust, something that puts the assets under the protection of a trustee who can't be influenced." He took a slow drink. "Good. That's good." He didn't need to tell me what he'd done. He just needed to know that I understood why he had done it. He'd just say, "Eric tells me Savannah is restructuring the company's debt, taking out a new line of credit against the fleet. She calls it strategic leveraging." And I'd reply, without looking up from my plate, "She's pulling the cash out. Grandpa, she's loading the company with debt, extracting the liquid capital, and parking it somewhere else. When the balloon payment comes due, Horizon won't have the cash flow to pay. The bank will seize the assets. she'll be insulated, and the company will be gone. Show me, he'd grumble. I started bringing my laptop. I didn't just work on his hypotheticals, I kept digging on my own. It became my obsession, my night job. It was all legal, all publicly available information, SEC filings, state and corporation records, federal transportation contract bids, which are public domain, UCC liens. It was all there, a breadcrumb trail of 1,000 tiny, seemingly legal transactions that, when assembled, painted a picture of a massive, ongoing heist. I stopped seeing it as a spreadsheet. I started to see it as a map. I spent a month, working late into the night, building the visualization. It was a complex flowchart on my secure server. On one side, a solid blue-black block, Pierce Horizon Freight. On the other side, a bright red, cancerous blob, Redstone Harbor Strategies. And in between, the arrows of extraction. An arrow for quarterly consulting fees, totaling over $800,000 a year. An arrow for the new, inflated fleet insurance policy, which I discovered was underwritten by a firm where Savannah's cousin was a silent partner. An arrow for the new logistics software lease, a $3 million program that duplicated systems Horizon already had, leased from a company that, 3 clicks later, turned out to be another shell, registered to Savannah's attorney. I watched the blue block shrink as the red block swelled. But it was the debt that gave me the endgame, the new line of credit, the leveraged assets. I finally saw the full, terrifying picture. This wasn't just theft, it was a planned execution. Savannah wasn't just trying to get rich, she was trying to neuter my father. She was systematically dismantling the one and only thing that gave him power and independence from her, my grandfather's company. When Horizon Freight finally collapsed under the weight of the debt she was creating, when the banks came and seized the trucks and the warehouses, my father, Eric Pierce, would have nothing. He would be a man in his late 50s with no job, no company, and no inheritance, because she'd already stolen it. He would be 100%, completely and irrevocably dependent on her, on the very money she had stolen. It was the perfect trap. At our next dinner, I didn't wait for his hypothetical. I opened my laptop, turned it to face him, and said, "This is it, Grandpa. This is the map." He watched, silent. As I clicked through the flowchart, I narrated the flow of money. I showed him the debt. I showed him the insurance kickback. I showed him the software lease. When I finished, he was quiet for a very long time. He just stared at the screen, at the systematic destruction of the company he had built with his bare hands. He looked old, in that moment, terribly old and terribly sad. "She's going to bankrupt him," I said, my voice urgent. "That's the plan. He'll have nothing left but her." "We have to stop her," I said, closing the laptop. "We have to show this to Dad. We have to call a board meeting. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. I stared at him. "No, Grandpa, she's stealing everything." "Not yet," he said. "The theft is in progress. It is not complete. She is smart. Madison, she has kept every transaction just on the right side of legal. Negligent, yes. Stupid, yes. But criminal? A good lawyer could argue she's just a tough negotiator, and your father is approving everything." "So we just wait?" I asked, incredulous. "We let her do it?" "We wait," he said, his eyes hardening, the sadness replaced by that familiar iron. "We wait until she overplays her hand. We wait until the theft is so large, so audacious, that not even my son can deny it. We let her build her own gallows. Right now, she's just buying the wood. We wait until she's standing on the platform with the rope around her neck." He signaled for the check. I was shaking with a different kind of energy. Frustration. I don't want revenge, Grandpa," I said, my voice pleading, quiet. "I don't want to destroy them." I looked at him. "I just want the truth to be seen. I just want him to see." Walter signed the check, his signature a sharp, angry slash. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, any sympathy for his son. "Madison," he said, his voice flat. "Sometimes, the truth is a hell of a lot more painful than revenge. Let's go." The waiting was the hardest part. After Walter left the dining room, after the echo of the slap had faded and been replaced by Savannah's sharp, panicked hissing at my father, I had simply stood up, collected my purse, and walked out. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at my father. I didn't acknowledge the livid purple handprint on my cheek. I just left. But this war, the real war, had started long before that night. It had been a cold, quiet, 18-month chess match. It began with Walter's cough. It was a small thing at first, a persistent rasp that winter. Then it became pneumonia. He was in the hospital in Wyoming for a week. He recovered, but the man who came out was not the same. The iron was still in his eyes, but the chassis was failing. He was 81 years old. He, who had always seemed indestructible, started using a cane. And the scent of weakness, of an empire in transition, traveled on the wind from Wyoming to Colorado. Savannah, who had previously viewed Walter as a hostile foreign power, suddenly became the picture of a devoted, loving daughter-in-law. "The vulture has landed," Walter had rasped to me over the phone, his voice thin and papery. "What's she doing?" I'd asked, my stomach tightening. "She brought soup," he'd grumbled. "In a thermos, tasted like lukewarm dishwater. She's fluffing the pillows. Maddie, she's measuring the drapes." She and my father began a full-scale campaign. They called it legacy planning. They called it getting his affairs in order. My father, of course, was the willing, spineless vanguard. "Maddie, I'm just calling to let you know. Savannah and I are going to be spending more time in Silver Glen," he told me, his voice strained with false concern. "We're worried about Grandpa. He's all alone up there. We're just trying to simplify his estate." "Simplify how, Dad?" "Oh, all these complicated old trusts and stock accounts. It's just so messy. Savannah has a wonderful financial advisor who thinks we can consolidate everything, make it easier for the future. Just put it all under one simple umbrella." Her umbrella, an umbrella that would conveniently funnel everything to her. They were flying blind. They were still operating under the assumption of the 2014 will, the one that left everything to Eric. They had no idea that Walter had already built a fortress. They were trying to simplify a treasury that he had already, quietly, emptied. That first phone call from my father was the trigger. Walter called me. "They're here," he said. "The campaign has begun. Time to finish the paperwork." Walter and Judith had already completed the new will. A hollow, mostly empty document, but the real work, the trust, was now being finalized. As Savannah and my father were reviewing his old, useless stock certificates in the living room, Walter was in his study, on a secure line with Judith, transferring the last of his controlling shares and the deed to the Wyoming property into the Walter Pierce Revocable Living Trust. He was making the will they were fighting over completely irrelevant. My next visit to Wyoming was not a social call. Walter's physical decline was more pronounced, but his eyes were like lasers. The vulture watch, as he called it, had ignited something in him. He had a video camera set up on a tripod, aimed at his desk. "What's this?" I asked. "Insurance," he grunted. "Judith's idea. The moment I'm gone, Savannah is going to scream senile. She's going to say I was confused. She'll say you unduly influenced me. So, we're going to make a little home movie." For 2 hours, I sat and watched as my grandfather, holding that day's copy of the Wall Street Journal to prove the date, delivered his final, blistering testament. He was lucid, he was furious, and he was precise. "I am Walter Pierce," he said, staring into the lens. "I am of sound mind and body. I am making these changes to my estate for several, very specific reasons." He laid it all out. He held up the copies of the Redstone Harbor invoices. He detailed the software lease, the insurance kickback. He named the dates, the times, the amounts. "My son, Eric Pierce," he said, his voice hard as stone. has been either grossly negligent or criminally complicit in the systematic theft of this company. He has failed in his fiduciary duty. Then, his voice dropped, gaining a new, cold weight. And he failed in his duty as a father. I was present on the evening of May 12th, when his wife, Savannah, physically assaulted my granddaughter, Madison, for the crime of speaking the truth. My son did nothing. He condoned it. I am making these changes, he concluded, not out of malice, but out of a duty to protect the legacy I built from those who would see it destroyed. This is my decision. It is final. He clicked the remote. The recording light went off. He was breathing heavily, exhausted from the effort, but his face was set in triumph. He had just laid his final trap. Now, he said, pulling a thick stack of papers from his desk. Your part. He slid them over. Judith's office just couriered these, the final signature pages for the trust. My hands were shaking as I read the title. Successor Trustee Appointment and Acceptance. In the event of my death or incapacitation, I name Madison Pierce as sole successor trustee, with full and unconditional authority over all assets contained within the Walter Pierce Revocable Living Trust. Grandpa, I whispered, this wasn't a hypothetical. This was the crown. This was the weapon. Don't get emotional, he snapped, though his voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it. It's not a gift. It's a job. It's the worst, most thankless job you'll ever have. You're the executor, the cleanup crew. You're the only one I trust not to let the thieves carry the whole damn thing away. Now, sign it. I signed my name. A local notary he'd had waiting in the kitchen was brought in. Her stamp hit the page with a sound like a gavel. It was done. But Savannah, for all her flaws, was not stupid. She was a predator, and she sensed that her prey was not behaving correctly. Walter was too accommodating. He'd sit through her pitches about consolidation with a thin, patient smile. That's very interesting, Savannah, he'd say. I'll certainly, consider it. He was stonewalling her, and it was making her nervous. She couldn't control Walter's assets, so she did the next best thing. She doubled down on controlling my father's. If she couldn't get the king, she would make damn sure she owned the prince. My father called me again, this time sounding harried, his voice tight. Maddie? Quick question. Savannah's attorneys are, well, they're just updating our wills, modernizing, and they need to know, just for their records. Do you have any independent assets? Anything they need to be aware of? I knew exactly what he was asking. Has Walter given you anything yet? I have a 401k from work and about $6,000 in a checking account. Dad, I said, my voice flat. That's it. Right, good. Just boilerplate. Just being thorough. Liar. They weren't just being thorough. They were locking him down. My curiosity, now a trained, professional instinct, took over. I used the access I had at Northline, the same databases I used to track financial predators, to look into public probate filings. And I found it. Eric Pierce, a new will, filed just last week. I read the summary, and my blood went cold. Savannah had put a poison pill in it. She was brilliant. I had to give her that. The will stipulated that if Eric inherited any assets from Walter Pierce, those assets were to be immediately and automatically transferred into a new, irrevocable trust, a trust controlled by a single trustee, Savannah. He had preemptively signed away his inheritance. She had built a perfect cage. If Walter died and left Eric everything, she would get it all within 10 business days. But she had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. Her entire brilliant plan was based on the assumption that Eric would inherit something. She had built a strategy for a war that was already over. She had no idea that Walter's trust bypassed Eric completely. The assets weren't going to Eric. They were staying in the trust, a trust that I now controlled. His will, giving her control of his inheritance, was a fantasy. He was giving her legal authority over a bank account that would forever have a zero balance. I told Walter what I'd found at our last steak dinner. He was looking frail, his hands shaking as he lifted his water glass. But when I told him about Eric's will, he laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that turned into a deep cough, but it was a real laugh. "A perfect cage," he wheezed, wiping his mouth. "She built a perfect, airtight cage for a tiger, not realizing the tiger has already left the continent." He reached into his breast pocket and slid a single folded document across the table. It was from Judith. "One last thing," he said. "The final lock on the door." I read it. Amendment to the Walter Pierce Revocable Living Trust. No contest clause. The legal language was brutal. It stipulated that if any beneficiary challenged the validity of the trust in any way, they would forfeit any and all provisions made for them. Walter had left Eric a token allowance, a small, monitored income stream, just enough to live on, just enough to make this clause stick. "They can sue," Walter said, his voice a whisper. "But the moment they file that suit, the little bit I left for your father, poof, it's gone. It forces their hand. Do they take the scraps I left them? Or do they risk it all for a case they can't possibly win, against a video of me from beyond the grave?" He looked at me, his eyes tired, but burning with a cold, clear light. "It's done now, Maddie. The machine is built. All it needs is for the power to be cut." He saw the anxiety in my face. My hands were gripping the edge of the table. "Now," he said, placing his old spotted hand over mine. His skin was like paper. "You go back to Denver. You go to your quaint little job. You pay your rent. You live your life. You don't poke the bear. You don't mention this to anyone. You just live. This part is over. The rest? It'll happen when it happens. Let me handle the rest." That was 3 months ago. I did exactly what he said. I lived. I worked. I was normal. Until this morning, the day of the reconciliation dinner Savannah had demanded. The one Walter, surprisingly, had insisted I attend. "Go," he'd said. "Go and sit there and know what you know. It'll be instructive." He was supposed to be there tonight, but he'd called to cancel, claiming he was meeting with lawyers. I knew he was meeting with Judith. And then, at 4 p.m., just as I was leaving my office to drive to Maple Ridge, a courier delivered a package to my desk. A thick, 9 by 12-inch envelope. It was sealed not just with glue, but with 3 heavy dark red wax seals, each impressed with his signet ring. My name was on the front, in his sharp, angry, familiar handwriting. On the back, he had written one single instruction: "Do not open until Judith Marrow tells you to." It was in my purse. It was sitting on the floor of my car as I drove away from the house, my cheek burning, the sound of that slap still ringing in my ears. The machine was built, and I had just watched Savannah, blinded by her own rage, personally pull the lever. The machine was built, the lever had been pulled, and then we waited. The call came 3 weeks after the dinner, on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't from my father. It was from a nurse in Wyoming. The word she used was peacefully. He had passed in his sleep, the mechanism of his heart. That great, stubborn, iron engine had finally, quietly, wound down. I sat at my desk at Northline, the phone receiver cold against my ear. The world around me kept moving. Keyboards clicked. My boss, Diaz, was walking to a meeting, holding a coffee. The data on my screen, a complex web of offshore accounts I'd been tracking, suddenly seemed ridiculous, small. I felt nothing, not a rush of grief, not relief, just a profound, hollow click, the sound of the most important component in a massive machine finally locking into place. The power was cut. The funeral was an exercise in high-performance theater. Savannah, as the grieving, devoted daughter-in-law, had outdone herself. It was held at the largest, most ostentatious cathedral in Maple Ridge. The casket, a polished mahogany monolith that must have cost $50,000, was drowned in a sea of white lilies. The scent was overpowering, the same suffocating, funereal smell from the dinner party. Savannah was front and center, draped in a black custom-tailored dress that looked more like couture than mourning. She wore a delicate black veil, and she wept. Her sobs were theatrical, perfectly timed, rising and falling for maximum effect. She clutched my father's arm, not for support, but as if staking a claim, branding him as the chief mourner's property. My father was a ghost. He was pale, his eyes vacant and lost. He wasn't weeping. He seemed utterly disconnected, a man walking through a scene he didn't understand. He was untethered. His anchor, Walter, was gone, and Savannah was his only point of contact with the earth. He looked at me once, his eyes pleading, but I felt nothing, no pity, no anger, just the cold, flat acknowledgement of a failed system. Lily and Owen sat beside them, looking bored and uncomfortable in their dark, expensive clothes. I sat in the second row, alone. The most interesting part of the funeral was not the family, it was the strangers. They filled the back half of the cathedral. Older men in worn, but clean, suits, their faces like road maps. They looked like retired drivers. The men Walter had started with. There was a woman my age who was quietly crying. A man who, I later learned, was a local professor whose entire education Walter had funded. There was Jim Ankerly, the old CFO, and Dave Schultz, the warehouse manager. This was his real family. These were the people his life had actually touched. They didn't come to see the show. They came to say goodbye to the man who had built them. After the service, as people milled awkwardly in the cold sunshine, Savannah was already in motion. She was networking. She was accepting condolences from business associates, her hand on my father's arm, her voice a low, throaty whisper of strength and continuity. I watched my father nodding numbly as one of his competitors patted his shoulder. "Eric, you just let me know if there's anything you need." Walter was a giant. "We'll be fine," Savannah said, her voice clear, stepping forward to answer for him. Eric is more than ready to step into his father's shoes. The company is in very, very capable hands. We're planning a full operational review next week. They were already planning the carve-up. They were measuring the throne while the king's body was still warm. A figure in a severe black suit detached from the crowd. Judith Marrow. She was a blade of a woman, all sharp angles and intelligent, unsentimental eyes. She ignored Savannah and my father completely, walking directly to me. "Ms. Pierce," she said. Her voice was low, professional. "Ms. Marrow." She didn't offer condolences. She wasn't built for them. She was an instrument of his will, and he was gone. "I was instructed to give you this," she said. She held out a thick 9 by 12-inch manila envelope. It was not the one Walter had sent to my office. This one was different, heavier, and it was sealed with 3 distinct dark red wax seals, each bearing his signet. This was the one. "What about the other?" I started. "That was a contingency," she said, cutting me off, understanding immediately. "This is the primary. The reading will be at my office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Do not be late, and do not, under any circumstances." Her eyes bored into mine. "Open this until after." "He told me not to open the other one until you—" "His instructions have been updated," Judith said. "He wanted you to have this one, from my hand. The other is now redundant. Destroy it. This is the only one that matters." She turned and walked away before I could reply. I held the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like a stone. I drove back to Denver. I did not attend the wake. The wake was for them. It was Savannah's coronation. My apartment, with its cheap furniture and humming radiator, was silent. I locked the deadbolt. I made a cup of black coffee. I sat at my small kitchen table. I looked at the envelope. After. After what? After the reading? No, that wasn't what Walter meant. That wasn't what Judith's eyes said. After the performance, after the lies, I was alone. It was time. My fingers, the same fingers I used to trace data through complex firewalls, were trembling as I broke the first wax seal. It cracked with a dry, brittle sound. Inside was not a ream of legal documents. It was a single smaller envelope and a black, encrypted USB drive. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of his heavy, watermarked stationery, the kind he used for things that mattered. It was his handwriting, sharp, angry, and perfectly clear. Madison. I'm gone. There is no time for grief. That is a luxury. This is work. You are now the successor trustee. Judith will explain the mechanics. I am explaining the why. I saw her hit you. I stood in that doorway and I saw it. I saw her violence, and I saw your father's cowardice. He let it happen. I have been watching her for 2 years. I knew she was a thief. I didn't realize she was a brute. And I didn't realize my son was a eunuch. That night, I disinherited him, not out of spite, out of necessity. A man who will not protect his own blood cannot be trusted to protect my company. He is compromised. He is her puppet. The trust I created, which you now control, bypasses him entirely. He will get a small allowance, just enough to live on, a leash, if he or Savannah contests the trust. The no contest clause I included will cut that leash, and he will get nothing, not $1. It is your choice whether to enforce it. On the USB drive is your armor. It is everything. The Redstone Harbor files, the invoices Eric signed, the reports from Judith's forensic team. It is a complete, ironclad case of her theft. Use it if they fight you. Use it to protect what is now yours. There is also a video file. Watch it last. You were the only one who saw. You were the only one who had the guts to look. Don't let them take it from you. Don't mourn me. Get to work. U.P. I read the letter 3 times. My hands were perfectly still now. The cold, clear, operational focus I felt at Northline washed over me. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was my CO, and he had just given me my orders. I plugged the USB drive into my secure laptop. The drive opened. It was meticulously organized. Redstone invoices Q1, Q4. Horizon Bank statements, Ackerley deposition, Schultz affidavit, Judith forensic analysis. It was the map, my map, but it wasn't just my public records data anymore. It was enriched. It was weaponized. Judith's team had gotten internal bank transfers, signed affidavits from the fired employees, email chains between Savannah and her consulting partners. She hadn't just siphoned $3 million, she had siphoned 7. She was accelerating the theft. She knew he was sick. She was trying to get it all out before he was gone. I spent all night reviewing the files. A data analyst, was watching a master predator at work. It was horrifying. It was brilliant. And it was all here. The evidence was irrefutable. At 4:30 in the morning, as the first, sick, gray light of dawn began to touch my windows, I clicked the last file. Testament WP MP4. I hit play. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was in his study in Wyoming. He looked tired, frail, but his eyes were on fire. He held up a copy of the Wall Street Journal. He stated the date. I am Walter Pierce, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I am of sound mind and body. I watched, mesmerized, as he delivered his final testament. I watched him hold up the invoices. I watched him detail the theft, piece by piece. I watched him name my father, not as a victim, but as a negligent accomplice. And then, his voice changed. Finally, he said, this is not just a financial decision, it is a moral one. He looked directly into the camera, and I felt he was looking at me. I was present on the evening of May 12th, when my son's wife, Savannah, physically assaulted my granddaughter, Madison. I saw it, and I saw my son, Eric, condone it with his silence. A man who will not protect his own blood cannot protect my legacy, he said. This is my decision. It is final. The screen went black. I sat there, in the silence of my apartment. As the sun came up, I didn't cry. He had left me no room for tears. He had left me only with a job. He had handed me a sword, a shield, and a complete, detailed map of the battlefield. My phone buzzed on the table. A new text. It was my father. "Maddie, I'm at the house. Savannah is... She's taking this all very hard, but she's being so strong. We're going to have a small family meeting after the reading tomorrow, just to go over, the transition. Savannah has some wonderful ideas for the future of the company." I looked at the text. I looked at the black screen of my laptop. Wonderful ideas. They were still celebrating. They were still dividing the spoils. They were sitting on their throne, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire castle had been signed over to someone else. I stood up. I went to my closet. I took a slow, hot shower. I bypassed the black suit I had worn to the funeral. Instead, I chose the suit I wore to Northline when I was giving a final presentation to a board. A sharp, charcoal gray pantsuit, a simple, silk shell. I did my hair. I did my makeup. I was not a mourner. I was not a victim. I was the successor trustee. I walked out of my apartment, the USB drive in my purse, my grandfather's letter in my pocket. I was perfectly, absolutely, and terrifyingly calm. I was not going to a reading. I was going to a transition meeting, just not the one they had planned. Judith Marrow's offices were on the 42nd floor, a sterile, high-altitude world of glass and brushed steel that smelled of old money and expensive, unscented soap. The conference room was vast, dominated by a single, 10-ton slab of polished black granite that served as a table. On one side, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a cold, indifferent view of the Denver skyline. They were already there. Savannah, in a severe but impeccably tailored black suit, had taken the seat at the head of the table, the seat of power. She was arranging a leather-bound folio and a silver pen in front of her, as if preparing to take notes, or perhaps to chair the meeting. She was the picture of a strong, grieving, but ultimately in charge widow. Except, of course, she was only a daughter-in-law. My father sat to her right, looking gray and shrunken. He had aged 10 years since the funeral. He couldn't stop drumming his fingers on the granite. A nervous, hollow tap, tap, tap. Lily and Owen were flanking him, looking sullen and out of place, their phones, for once, not in their hands but placed face down on the table. I took the only remaining chair, directly opposite Savannah, at the other end of the long, cold table. She nodded at me, a tight, thin-lipped smile that was more a baring of teeth than a greeting. "Madison," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending, funereal sorrow. "Thank you for coming. We're all just trying to get through this." Walter would have wanted a swift, clean transition. I said nothing. I just placed my hands on the table. The door opened with a near-silent snick, and Judith Marrow entered. She held a single, thick, leather-bound document. She did not look at any of us. She walked to the center of the table, placed the document down, and remained standing. "We are here," she began, her voice a flat, emotionless instrument, "to read the last will and testament of Walter P. Pierce." Savannah leaned forward, her in-charge expression fixed. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice. Judith, it's a difficult time. We're just hoping to simplify things. Eric, as the sole heir, is ready to..." "I will begin," Judith said, cutting her off, her voice slicing through Savannah's performance like a scalpel. She opened the folder. "I must state for the record that this is the only valid will. It was signed and executed by Mr. Pierce on May 12th of this year." The tap-tap-tapping of my father's fingers stopped. Savannah's head snapped up. May 12th, the night of the slap. A flicker of something, not fear, just uncertainty, crossed Savannah's face. She visibly straightened her spine. "As per Mr. Pierce's wishes," Judith continued, "we will begin with the specific bequests." She read a short list, a bequest of $50,000 to the University of Wyoming's engineering program, $10,000 each to Jim Ackerley and Dave Schultz, with a note of thanks for their years of loyalty. Savannah was already shaking her head, a small, dismissive gesture. "Tidying up," she whispered to my father, loud enough for me to hear. Loose ends. Now, Judith said, her voice unchanged, we come to the family. This was it. Savannah's posture became rigid. My father held his breath. To my son, Judith read, Eric Pierce. Savannah's hand found my father's, squeezing it in triumph. I bequeath a lifetime allowance to be held in and disbursed from a third-party managed fund in the amount of $5,000 per month. This stipend is for his personal use and cannot be assigned, transferred, or used as collateral for any loan. The silence was a physical thing. $5,000 a month. It was an insult. It was gas money. My father looked, quite literally, like he had been punched in the stomach. What? He whispered. Savannah's face, that mask of perfect, grieving composure, had turned to stone. That's nothing. That's a pre-allowance. Eric, what is this? I don't know, he stammered. And, Judith continued, her voice plowing forward, to my daughter-in-law, Savannah Pierce. Savannah's eyes, wide with shock, snapped to Judith. I bequeath my complete collection of mid-century German paperweights, which are currently in storage. I trust you will find them as heavy and as cold as I did. A joke! Savannah shrieked, her voice cracking, all pretense of sorrow or decorum incinerated. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. This is a joke. This is not his will. His will leaves everything to Eric. Everything. We had it reviewed. You had a 2014 will reviewed, Ms. Pierce, Judith said, not looking up. It was revoked and superseded by this one. Please sit down. I will not sit down. This is theft. He was senile. He was sick. And she, her perfectly maniciled finger, shaking with rage, shot across the table, aimed at me. She did this. She got to him. She poisoned him against his own family. You ungrateful little. You are correct about one thing, Ms. Pierce, Judith said, her voice cut. Once again, through the hysteria. This will is largely ceremonial. It disposes of personal effects. Savannah froze, a new, calculating light in her eyes. What? What do you mean? The vast majority of Mr. Pierce's assets, 100% of his controlling shares in Pierce Horizon Freight, his real estate holdings, including the Silver Glen property, and all liquid assets, valued at an estimated $94 million, are not part of this will. My father let out a strangled gasp of relief. The trust, Savannah said, her voice triumphant. Of course, the trust. Eric and I discussed this with him. He was just moving it into the trust for tax purposes, which, as his wife, They are held, Judith interrupted, her voice like a hammer blow, in the Walter Pierce Revocable Living Trust, a trust that, upon his death, became irrevocable. The trust documents, also dated May 12th, are quite clear. She paused, for the first time, and looked directly at me, then back at Savannah. As per the articles of the trust, the sole successor trustee, with full and unconditional authority over all assets, is Ms. Madison Pierce. I have never, in my life, heard a sound like the one Savannah made. It was not a word. It was a high, thin, guttural noise of pure, primal negation.
No, she screamed, her face a dark, mottled red. No, I will not allow it. He was not competent. He was a sick old man. She manipulated him. I will have this invalidated by noon. I will have her disbarred, she shrieked at Judith. I will have you all in court for the rest of your lives.
Dad? Lily cried, her voice cracking in panic. Dad, what is she talking about? Is she in charge? Is our money gone? My father was just shaking his head, his face ashen. He wouldn't. Maddie, what did you do to him? I said nothing. I didn't have to. I just looked at Judith. Judith sighed, a small puff of air, as if this were all terribly tedious. Mr. Pierce, she said, anticipated this reaction. He was, as you'll see, quite lucid. He prepared a final statement. She pressed a button on the console in the center of the table. A large screen, concealed behind a panel of dark wood, lit up the wall. And my grandfather's face, tired, angry, but devastatingly alive, filled the room. "I am Walter Pierce," he began. Savannah stopped screaming. She froze. My father looked up, his eyes wide with terror. They watched, in absolute, paralyzed silence, as their executioner spoke from beyond the grave. He held up the invoices. "The theft," he said, his voice rumbling from the speakers. "From Redstone Harbor Strategies, approved by my son." Savannah let out a small, strangled sound. He detailed the dates, the amounts, the insurance scam, the software lease. He laid her entire, brilliant, secret plan bare on the table. "He is a fool," Walter's voice boomed, "and she is a thief. But this is not just a financial decision, it is a moral one." He looked directly into the camera. His eyes seemed to bore through the screen, past me, and land directly on Savannah. "I was present on the evening of May 12th, he said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper, "when my son's wife, Savannah, physically assaulted my granddaughter, Madison. I saw it. I saw her hand strike my granddaughter's face, and I saw my son, Eric, condone it with his silence. I cannot, and will not, leave my life's work in the hands of those who distort the truth, who value money over blood, and who condone violence. This is my decision. It is final." The screen went black. The only sound in the room was my father, who was now weeping, his head in his hands, making a low, gulping, animal sound. He saw, oh God, he saw. Savannah was white, chalk white. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. She looked at me, her eyes no longer filled with rage, but with a new, dawning, animal terror. "And one last item," Judith said into the ringing silence. "The trust contains a standard no-contest clause. If any named beneficiary, which includes you, Mr. Pierce, and by extension, your minor children, challenges the validity of this trust, or the actions of the trustee, for any reason, your provision." She looked at my father. "The $5,000 monthly income is immediately and permanently forfeited. You will get nothing." Savannah's head snapped up. The terror was gone, replaced by a final, desperate, reptilian fury. "I don't care about his 5,000. I'll file a suit for corporate fraud. I'll take the company from her. I'll prove she is incompetent. I will drag her through the mud until—" "Will you?" Judith asked, her voice laced with an exhaustion that was, for her, the equivalent of a smile. She reached under the table and produced a thick, black, spiral-bound file. It was a printed copy of everything on the USB drive. She slid it across the polished granite. It stopped directly in front of Savannah's leather folio. "That," Judith said, "is the complete forensic accounting package on Redstone Harbor Strategies. My copy. It details, to the dollar, $7,400,000 in provable corporate fraud, complete with your electronic signatures and the relevant bank transfers. It is, in short, a complete, gift-wrapped criminal case. The moment you or any attorney representing you files a civil suit, I am under binding instruction from Mr. Pierce to forward this file, along with Mr. Pierce's video testimony, to the Office of the District Attorney and the Internal Revenue Service." Savannah stared at the file as if it were a coiled snake. Lily, finally, understood. Her face, a mask of bored teenage indifference, crumpled into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You!" she screamed. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Savannah. "You were stealing it? You stupid bitch! You lost it! You lost our money!" "Savannah," my father whispered, finally looking up, his face a ruin of tears and incomprehension. What is that file? What did I sign?" The chaos erupted. Lily was screaming at her mother. My father was pulling at his hair, muttering, I signed. I just signed. Owen, silent until this moment, scrambled from his chair, ran to the corner of the room, and was violently, noisily sick into a large, decorative ficus plant. Savannah just stood there, frozen, trapped between the screaming of her children, the weeping of her puppet, and the black, undeniable evidence of her crimes. Judith Marrow stood. She smoothed the front of her suit jacket. "I believe this concludes the reading," she said. She looked at me. "Ms. Pierce, my office will be in touch by 4 p.m. to begin the transition of assets. The bank has already been notified of your authority." She then looked, one last time, at the imploding, screaming, vomiting wreckage of my family. "We are finished here." I walked out of Judith Marrow's conference room, the sound of Lily screaming at her mother, the smell of Owen's sickness, the sight of my father weeping into his hands. I left it all behind in that glass tower. The doors slid shut behind me, and the chaos was sealed in. I was no longer Madison Pierce, the family scapegoat. I was Madison Pierce, trustee. The transition, as Judith called it, was swift. It was not a transition. It was an amputation. My first day at Pierce Horizon Freight. I didn't go to the executive suite. I went to the accounting department. I walked in with a team of 3 forensic accountants from Northline. Diaz had loaned them to me. "My name is Madison Pierce," I told the shell-shocked CFO, the slick young man Savannah had hired. "I am the new, sole authority for the trust that owns this company. You will provide my team with unrestricted access to all servers, accounts, and pending invoices, immediately." He tried to stall. "I'm afraid I'll need authorization from Mr. Pierce or Ms. Pierce." "You mean Savannah," I said, not unkindly. I handed him the 2-page document from Judith, the one summarizing the trust's authority. "Savannah is no longer associated with this company. Neither, for that matter, is my father. If you delay, I will have security escort you out, and you will become part of the fraud investigation. If you comply, you might just be a witness." He complied. The audit was brutal. It was exactly as Walter and I had mapped. But worse, she had gotten sloppy in the last few months, accelerating the theft, transferring sums as large as $200,000 for brand assessments that never happened. Savannah, meanwhile, was not quiet. She was accustomed to winning. She was a fighter, but she was trapped. I learned from Judith that Savannah had spent 2 days frantically calling every aggressive litigator in Colorado, trying to find someone to take her case, but the trap Walter built was perfect. The moment they heard about the no contest clause, cutting Eric off, and the other file, the criminal one, they refused. She couldn't sue me, so she turned her fury on the only tool she had left, my father. She tried to get him to contest the will. "She's stolen it. Eric, your father's legacy. She'll run it into the ground. You have to fight for your children." But the no contest clause had him in a vice. If he fought, he lost his $5,000 a month leash. He was a coward, yes, but he was also a man who had just seen his entire $90 million future evaporate. He clung to that tiny stipend like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. He refused. This, I imagine, was the final, fatal break for Savannah. He had failed her. He was no longer useful. The end, when it came, didn't even come from me. It came from the system. As part of the audit, I had to pause all pending payments, including a massive $1 million quarterly payment on the new line of credit Savannah had taken out. The bank, seeing a change in control and a missed payment, flagged the account. They opened an investigation. They investigated the loan's purpose. They investigated the recipient of the funds. They investigated Redstone Harbor strategies. A bank, unlike a son, does not sign things without reading them. Within a week, the bank's internal fraud division found exactly what I had found. They found a shell corporation billing the company it had just loaned money to. They found Savannah's name as the sole agent. They found conflicts of interest, breaches of fiduciary duty, and 6 counts of wire fraud. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a federal crime. The bank's lawyers called Judith. They didn't want a scandal. They wanted their money. They wanted the loan invalidated and the person responsible held accountable. The news must have hit the glass house in Maple Ridge like a tactical strike. My father was now facing a choice: stand by his wife and be named as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud case, or cut her loose. For the first time in his life, his cowardice served a useful purpose. He chose to save himself. He filed for divorce 2 days later. He called me. He asked me to meet him, not at the house, not at the office, at a neutral, sad little coffee shop in a strip mall. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. He was just a man, a weak, broken, middle-aged man. He sat across from me, stirring a coffee he wasn't drinking. "She's gone," he whispered. She took the art, the jewelry, the cars that were in her name. She just left. She was indicted, Dad, I said, my voice flat, not unkind. The bank is pressing charges. I know. I had to sign things. For the lawyers. Statements. He finally looked up at me, his eyes brimming with a lifetime of unspent, useless tears. Maddie, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know what I was signing. She just said it was logistics, taxes. I trusted her. I sat there, looking at him, the old anger, the burning, righteous fury of the girl with the slapped cheek was gone. I just felt a profound, heavy sadness. You didn't trust her. Dad, I said, my voice quiet, but clear. You were afraid of her. There's a difference. I wanted peace. He wept, the tears now rolling down his cheeks. I just wanted the house to be quiet. I failed you. I know I failed you. That night, with the diary and the dinner, God, Maddie, he saw me do nothing. Yes, I said. He saw, and I saw. You chose, Dad. You chose to be quiet. You chose silence, again and again. That was your choice. And this is the consequence. He broke then. He covered his face and he sobbed. A raw, ugly sound that had been buried for 30 years. He admitted everything. The weakness, the fear, the willful ignorance. He apologized. I didn't say, I forgive you. It would have been a lie. The wound was too deep, the scar tissue too thick. But I did reach across the table. I placed my hand on his. The audit is finished, I said. The company is stable. It's smaller, but it's clean. I'm moving the headquarters to Wyoming. If you really want to, there's a job for you. Operations manager, in the warehouse. It's what you were always good at. It's what Grandpa always said you were good at. It's a real job. You'll answer to me. But it's a start. He looked up, his face a ruin, a tiny, desperate flicker of hope in his eyes. Yes, he whispered. Okay, yes, okay. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a road. It was a chance to build something new, something real, from the wreckage. Savannah, naturally, did not go quietly into the night. Her trial was pending. Her assets were frozen. She was ruined. So she turned to the only court she had left, social media. She posted a long, rambling video on her Instagram, her in a borrowed room, no makeup, her hair a mess, a performance of a victim. My husband's family has stolen everything from me, she cried to the camera. My husband's daughter, a vindictive, unstable woman, manipulated an old, sick man into cutting his own son out of his will. She has seized control of a company she knows nothing about. She has destroyed our family. It was all lies. All of it. The post got traction. People were sympathetic. A grieving family torn apart by a greedy daughter. I watched it, sipping my coffee. I called Judith. I'm tired of this narrative, I said. I agree, she replied. I don't know how it happened, but the next day, an anonymous, password-protected link was sent to a dozen of the top financial reporters in Colorado. The link contained one, very small, very specific file. Testament WP MP4. By noon, the story was everywhere. Pierce freight heir disinherited after wife's multi-million-dollar fraud and violence, says CEO's final video. They didn't just see his words, they saw her invoices. They saw the clips of him detailing the theft. Savannah's self-pitying post was buried under an avalanche of truth. She was exposed, humiliated, and finally, silenced. I used the money from the sale of the Maple Ridge glass box. The bank sold it to cover her debts. To start a foundation, the Walter Pierce Foundation. It provides scholarships for women entering data science, and it provides pro bono legal funds for people, usually children, trying to escape financially controlling and abusive family situations. A few months later, when the legal dust had settled and the company was finally stable, I drove to Silver Glen. The house was just as I remembered it, the smell of pine, old leather, and whiskey. It was quiet. It was mine. I went to his study, the heavy oak desk, the view of the lake. I sat in his chair. I was just breathing. I opened the bottom drawer, the one he always kept locked. My new keys, the trustee keys, opened it easily. Inside, there was a file. It was his old will, the 2014 will, the one Savannah had been banking on. I read it. It was exactly what she'd thought. I leave my entire estate, all shares, all property, all assets, to my beloved son, Eric Pierce. He had meant for my father to have it all of it. Underneath the will, there was a single, small, yellow sticky note. It was stuck to the folder. It was Walter's handwriting. It was dated May 13th, the day after the slap. It just said, "Changed my mind the day she raised her hand to you. Not my son, not anymore." I took the note, I took the old, voided will, and I walked outside, to the stone fire pit that overlooked the lake. I lit a match. I watched the paper blacken and curl, the words "my beloved son" turning to ash and floating away over the dark, cold water. The air was clean. It was the first clean breath I had taken in 32 years. A family, I realized, is a contract. It's a story we agree to tell. But when the story becomes a lie, when the contract is broken, it can be rewritten. I stood there, in my grandfather's coat, in front of my grandfather's house, and for the first time, I felt truly, completely, and finally free. Family can be rewritten, and this time, I am the one holding the pen. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Let me know in the comments, and share your thoughts on this. Please subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.